The rancher's dog wouldn't stop barking at the windmill. Not at the sky. At the ground. When Elias finally went to check, the earth sounded hollow, and beneath it, he found a trapdoor. Inside? Chains, blankets, a carved wooden token. That's when the boy he'd just taken and wounded, Silent, looked at it and said, "That's where he kept us." The men coming to take the boy back wore badges, but they weren't here for justice. They were here to bury the truth. The only question now is, would you have listened to the dog? Before we uncover what lay beneath the windmill, the name that broke a town's silence, and the ledger that turned lawmen into criminals, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. These stories aren't just suspense, they're echoes of truths long buried and voices nearly lost. Your support keeps them alive. One click helps us dig deeper, speak louder, and remember what others tried to erase. Thank you. The wind clawed across the prairie like it had a vendetta. It didn't whistle, it screeched, dragging grit through every gap in the boards of the ranch house, turning windows into percussion and the sky into a swirling bruise. Dust billowed in hungry sheets, blotting out the horizon. Even the livestock had gone silent, huddled against the fence line like condemned men. Elias McCrae stood motionless on the porch, one boot on the top step, the other planted wide. His fingers gripped the Winchester like it was part of his spine. The storm had woken him. Or maybe it wasn't the storm, maybe it was the dog. Boone had been barking for over an hour, not the playful kind, not even the territorial bark he gave to coyotes. This was insistent, low, guttural, pulsing, a warning, not to the wind. At the windmill, the old structure creaked and swayed 100 feet out, silhouetted by lightning and backlit in eerie flashes. It hadn't turned in years. The blades were rusted stiff, their joints fused with time and grit. Elias narrowed his eyes. Boone stood fixed near its base, hackles raised, tail stiff like rebar. Every few seconds he would lunge forward, then retreat, pacing a tight arc, as though drawing a line no one should cross. And that was when Elias saw it movement. Not much, just a shift. A flicker of darker shape against the base of the tower, where the concrete footing had long been cracked and swallowed by weed and root. Elias raised the rifle slowly. Lightning carved the sky again, and in its brief flare, he saw it clearer. Not a man, not an animal. The ground, sagging inward, shuddering. A hollow sound followed, almost imperceptible beneath the wind's scream. Not an echo, a thud, muffled, deliberate. Boone barked again, this time sharper, more frantic. Elias moved. He stepped down into the storm, coat whipping around him like a torn flag, boots crunching on parched dirt and dead brush. The air tasted like copper and grit. With each step closer to the windmill, his breath grew shallower, not from the effort, but from the feeling pooling in his gut. Something wasn't right. Hadn't been for a while. He reached Boone, rested a hand on the dog's neck, but the animal didn't calm. He trembled under Elias's fingers. Elias knelt and pressed his palm to the earth. It was cold, wrong. The vibration wasn't just wind, something was beneath. The next lightning flash lit up a faint outline, circular, metal, almost mist under the dirt. A hatch. Elias brushed the surface, bolted shut, worn smooth by time, but not abandoned. This wasn't ranching equipment. It wasn't even from his time. He looked at Boone. The dog let out a low growl, as if urging him, not warning. Elias raised his eyes to the windmill's top, where a weather vane spun wildly despite the blade's stillness. Another thud below, closer now. He tightened his grip on the rifle and whispered to the dark, "Who the hell's under my land?" The wind didn't answer, but the ground did. The morning had begun like most others on the edge of the flats, slow, sun-baked, and quiet in that particular way the land gets when it's holding its breath. Elias McCrae stood near the southern fence line, one gloved hand bracing a cedar post, while the other swung a worn sledgehammer with rhythm bred from repetition. Each blow rang out across the open expanse, the sound swallowed quickly by heat and space. The fence hadn't been touched in 3 seasons. Elk had knocked through it sometime last winter, and the wire had curled back on itself like it had given up trying to hold the world out. Elias didn't blame it. Still, it had to be done. Things had to hold. Boone watched from a patch of dry shade beneath the frame of the old truck bed, tongue out, ears flicking with every hammer strike. The dog's coat was grizzled like his owner's beard, more gray than black now, but the eyes were sharp, too sharp for the stillness. Elias paused, wiped his brow with the crook of his arm. The heat was rising already. He pulled a strip of jerky from his coat pocket and tore it in two, tossing one half toward Boone. The dog caught it in the air, chewed thoughtfully, eyes still fixed not on Elias, but toward the windmill. It loomed in the middle distance, a skeleton of its former self. Once, it had pulled clean water from the underground aquifer, the lifeline of the ranch. Now it just stood there, rusting at the joints, blades too locked to spin. The creak of it came slow and irregular, like a death rattle in the breeze. Boone growled. It was soft at first, low in the throat, not hostile but alert. Elias followed the line of his dog's gaze, squinting through the shimmer of rising heat. Nothing. Just the windmill, the brittle grass, and the endless stretch of dust beyond. But Boone got up, ears forward, tail stiff. "You hear something?" Elias muttered, not really asking. He dropped the hammer, picked up the rifle, leaning nearby, habit, not panic. Boone had done this before, barked at shadows, chased scents no man could trace, sometimes coyotes, sometimes worse, and sometimes nothing at all. They walked the short trail back to the ranch house, dust crunching underfoot, the distant hum of flies circling somewhere behind them. Boone kept glancing back at the windmill, occasionally stopping, as if waiting for Elias to notice something he hadn't. But the old man just muttered, "Ain't nothin' but ghosts and bad Weldon, boy." He poured water into Boone's dish once they reached the porch, then settled into the rocking chair that hadn't rocked right in years. The wind was picking up, he felt it in his joints. A front was moving in. Maybe storm, maybe just dry wind, but the air had shifted. Boone drank quickly, then sat facing the windmill again, tense, watching. The creak came again. Not from the blades. From the base. Elias's brow furrowed. A single fly landed on his forearm, and he didn't brush it away. The silence stretched too long, the kind that hums in your teeth. Boone growled once more. This time, Elias didn't dismiss it. He just stared at the windmill with him, and said under his breath, "All right then." It started with the cough, barely audible at first, just a ragged hitch in the wind. Elias paused mid-step on his way back from the barn, hand resting on the gate latch, eyes narrowing. Boone had already stopped, ears perked. The dog tilted his head toward the western ridge, where the land dipped into a wash of mesquite and hardpan. Then it came again, sharper this time, a choked, human sound. Not the kind you hear from someone clearing their throat. This one dragged desperation behind it, torn from somewhere deep, where air fights to escape with blood in it. Elias didn't move right away, he just listened. The sun was cruel overhead, unbroken, and hot enough to blister paint. The wind had dropped into an eerie stillness, like the earth itself had stopped breathing. That's when Boone took off in a low sprint, not barking, just moving. Elias followed. They crested the shallow ridge together, boots crunching loose gravel, and saw him. The boy lay half-curled near the dry arroyo, dust caked to the side of his face, shirt torn, one shoe missing. His skin was sunburnt and blotched with dirt. One arm was cradled tight to his chest. The other stretched weakly toward the sky, as if reaching for a rope that wasn't there. His eyes were slits just enough to show panic. He coughed again, dry and hacking. Boone slowed, sniffed the air, then circled wide but close, tail stiff. Elias lowered the rifle. The boy couldn't have been more than 12, maybe 13 if he'd had a full meal in the last week, which, by the look of his frame, he hadn't. His lips were cracked white. His shirt had a dark stain that looked black in the light, but Elias could smell the copper even before he knelt. The kid tried to sit up, gasped, and nearly passed out doing it. "Easy now," Elias said, crouching beside him, voice low but firm. "Ain't no call to fight, you're safe." The boy's mouth moved. No sound came out. Just the shape of a word. Elias didn't ask what. He slid the canteen from his hip and poured a bit into the boy's mouth, slow. The kid gulped too fast and sputtered. Elias waited. No questions, not yet. He pulled off his jacket and draped it over the boy's shoulders, then looked over the horizon. No dust trails, no riders. No reason for this kid to be here unless he ran from something. Boone sat beside them now, quiet, watching the way dogs do when they understand things without language. The boy lifted his good hand and let it rest on the dog's head. Boone didn't move. Elias stood, gave one last look west, then bent and gently lifted the boy into his arms. The kid was light, too light, bones and fear, no name offered. Elias didn't ask for one. He carried him back toward the house, backlit by the rising wind. He didn't know who the boy was, or what storm followed behind him. But he knew this: a man's land is his own, and a dying child don't belong in the dirt. The sun hung low, bleeding orange across the western sky, casting long shadows that crept like fingers over the ranch. Elias sat on the edge of the porch, whittling a dry strip of mesquite. The scent curled faintly in the air, sharp, smoky. He wasn't shaping anything in particular, just passing time with muscle memory, the way a man does when words don't serve. Behind him, the screen door groaned open and shut. Santi stepped out, barefoot, wrapped in Elias's old flannel shirt that hung from his shoulders like draped canvas. He moved gingerly, favoring his side, and carried a chipped enamel mug of broth with both hands as if it might slip through him. His eyes scanned the land like it might vanish if he blinked too long. The boy hadn't said much all afternoon, only nods, slight gestures, and once, a nearly whispered thank you when Elias stitched the gash on his arm. Boone barked, sharp, urgent. The boy froze. The dog was near the windmill again, pacing at its base, growling low, tail stiff. He kept darting looks toward the porch, as if trying to drag Elias's gaze with him. Elias didn't rise. Neither did he look away. Santi's shoulders went rigid. He dropped to a crouch on instinct, the mug tipping in his hands. Some of the broth spilled and steamed off the sun-warmed wood. His eyes were wide. Not confused, afraid. Elias set the whittling knife down beside him and studied the boy. Santi's breath came shallow. He looked smaller in the dying light, skin pale beneath dust and old bruises. Boone barked again, and Santi flinched like it was a gunshot. "You don't like the sound of dogs?" Elias asked, softly. Santi didn't respond. "I ain't gonna hurt you, boy," Elias said, just above a whisper. "Ain't nobody gonna. But you keep jumping like someone trained you to." Still nothing. Just the sound of the windmill creaking in rhythm with Boone's growls. Elias let the silence stretch a little longer, then shifted his eyes downward. The boy's sleeves had ridden up. His wrists, thin as fence wire, were marked dark, scabbed lines wrapped around them like memory. Not fresh, but not healed. Rings of pain, of restraint. Elias's jaw set. He didn't reach out. He didn't point. He just said, quiet but direct, "Who did this to you?" Santi stared at the ground. The sky darkened behind him, swallowing what was left of the Sunday. The boy's lips parted, but no sound came. Just a breath, a ghost of an answer. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It spoke, loud enough. Boone barked once more in the distance, then went quiet, as if he'd decided no one was listening. Elias stood and walked to the edge of the porch, rifle leaning nearby, gaze fixed on the windmill. It loomed darker now, half silhouetted against the dusk, the base wrapped in creeping shadow. The land was still but not calm. Santi remained crouched, shivering even though the heat hadn't fully left the air. Elias didn't ask again. Some answers need waiting. Others need uncovering. The night came down hard and fast, thick with dust and the metallic taste of unsettled air. A storm hadn't broken, but the land seemed to brace for one, holding its breath in the dark. Boone lay curled near the porch steps, ears twitching, eyes open. Inside, the boy slept fitfully on the old cot. Elias had dragged into the parlor, a damp cloth over his forehead, the half-finished bowl of beans untouched on the side table. Elias sat in his worn armchair, rifle propped beside him, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. The flame of the kerosene lamp flickered low, casting long shadows that danced along the wooden walls. The air felt wrong, like something had shifted beneath it. Boone growled. Elias stood, slowly, and reached for the rifle. From the edge of the property, just past the far gate, came the low thunder of hooves 4, maybe 5 riders. No lanterns, just the dull clop of metal on dirt, deliberate and unhurried. Not neighbors, not at this hour. Elias stepped onto the porch, boots creaking softly against the planks, Boone now standing rigid at his side. The dog didn't bark, he just watched, body tight as wire. In the distance, the dark shapes resolved into men on horseback, wide-brimmed hats pulled low, coats trailing like shadow. One of them dismounted before the others reached the gate. He walked forward alone. "Evenin', Mr. McCrae," the man called, voice rough but practiced. Elias said nothing. The man stepped into the low light spilling from the porch, revealing a silver badge pinned crooked on his duster. The emblem of the Basin Authority caught the light. Behind him, the others waited in silence. "We're looking for a boy," the man continued. "Young, maybe 13. Escaped a holding camp down near Dry Bend. Dangerous type, might have come this way." Elias kept his face unreadable. "Ain't seen no one but dust and deer all week." The man smiled without warmth. "We had tracks. Cut through the ridgeline, they lead here. Tracks got a habit of leading nowhere when the wind kicks up." Elias replied, voice calm. Another rider approached, younger, his horse restless beneath him. He spoke quietly to the lead man, who turned slightly toward him, listening. Elias watched that. Hierarchy. The younger one didn't carry himself like the others. Too rigid, nervous. The lead man turned back. "Mind if we have a look around?" "I do," Elias said. Not a threat, just final. The silence that followed pressed down heavy. Somewhere inside the house, the floor creaked, the boy shifting, perhaps hearing voices in his sleep. Elias didn't flinch. Boone growled low, the sound more warning than threat. The man stepped back, hands raised a little, mock genteel. "We'll be back with a warrant by morning." "You do that," Elias said. The riders turned slowly. No rush, no bluster. But the message was clear. This wasn't over. As their silhouettes disappeared into the dark, Elias finally breathed again. He looked down at Boone, then back toward the house. Inside, the boy had sat up in the cot, eyes wide, listening. "They're not gone," he whispered. Elias nodded. "I know." The morning broke brittle and colorless, as if the sun had risen out of obligation rather than promise. Pale light filtered through the haze, casting the landscape in a sickly gray. No birds sang. The wind had quieted, but in the stillness, Boone's barking cut sharp against the silence, urgent, repetitive, like a bell that wouldn't stop tolling. Elias stood at the sink, hands wrist deep in cold water, staring out the kitchen window. Boone was out there again, by the windmill, same spot, same posture, barking toward the base, like he expected something to answer. He dried his hands on a towel and stepped outside, the screen door whining behind him. Santi was still asleep, or pretending to be. Elias hadn't pressed him with questions, not yet. But the storm wasn't waiting, it was circling. Boone's voice grew louder as Elias approached, tail rigid, paws digging small trenches into the dry dirt. He wasn't barking at a sound, he was barking at a place. Elias slowed as he neared the windmill. Boots sinking just slightly into the soft crust of ground that had felt solid for decades. The blades above barely shifted in the breeze, but the creaking groan they let out crawled down his spine. Boone stepped back to make room for him, but didn't leave. The ground here was strange. Not just dry but too flat, too smooth in places. He knelt, ran a calloused hand over the dirt, and paused. There was a faint seam beneath the dust, barely visible. A curve too perfect to be natural. Elias rose and walked to the barn. He came back with a crowbar. Boone circled, whining now, pacing in anxious loops as Elias dug the tip into the earth. A layer of packed dust gave way to something metallic, rusted, but solid. He scraped more. The outline became clearer. Not a buried tool, not pipe, a hatch. Elias stepped back and looked at the windmill towering above him. It wasn't just old, it was guarding something. He rapped his knuckles on the hatch. Hollow. Not the sound of buried stone or root. It echoed faintly, like a drumhead. He pressed his ear to it, squinting against the sunlight. Nothing. Just the faint groan of metal expanding in the heat. Then barely perceptible a sound. A shift beneath. Not wind, not ground settling. Something moved. Or had moved, he couldn't be sure. Elias stood and dusted off his hands. The hatch was sealed, but the lock was old. It could be opened. Question was, should it? Boone barked again, but this time it wasn't frantic. It was insistent. Behind him, the porch creaked. Elias turned to see Santi standing barefoot on the steps, arms wrapped around his ribs. His face was pale, but his eyes were fixed on the windmill, not in curiosity, but dread. Elias didn't ask. Not yet. The boy looked at the hatch, then at Boone, then back at Elias. His voice was soft, shaking. Don't open it. Elias didn't move, didn't speak. Just stared at the place where the ground shouldn't be hollow. Where something had been hidden maybe for years. And now, maybe not hidden enough. The sun was climbing, casting harsh white light across the dry stretch of land. But beneath the windmill, all felt dimmer, muted, like the air itself knew something wasn't meant to be disturbed. Elias had returned with a pry bar, lantern, and quiet resolve. Boone stood back, whining low, tail sweeping the dirt in uneasy arcs. Santi sat on the porch, knees pulled to his chest, arms wrapped tight. He hadn't said another word, but his eyes had followed every move Elias made. The first pop of rusted hinges giving way sounded like a gunshot in the stillness. Elias strained, sweat mixing with dust as the iron hatch finally cracked open, releasing a breath of air that had been trapped in darkness far too long. It didn't stink, not exactly. But it carried the heavy scent of old things, forgotten things, damp earth, mold, and something Elias couldn't name but felt in his teeth. He swung the hatch fully open and shone the lantern down. A narrow wooden ladder descended into the dark. The walls were lined with old stones, uneven, stacked with haste. Not a proper storm shelter. This wasn't built for survival. It was meant for hiding. Elias hesitated only a moment before climbing down, boots thudding softly on each rung. The cellar was barely tall enough to stand in. The walls bled with moisture, and the floor was packed earth, cracked in places. Dust floated like disturbed spirits. Then the light hit the far corner, and Elias stopped breathing for a second. Chains hung from metal bolts set into the stone. Iron cuffs still latched at the ends. Beneath them lay a thin blanket, frayed and stained, bald in the shape of someone who'd curled tight to stay small. A tin cup sat nearby, knocked over. The corner smelled faintly of rust, sweat, and fear. Elias turned slowly, lifting the lantern higher. More blankets, a rotted wooden crate with an old pair of child's shoes. Scratches on the stone lines and notches in counted days. 50, more? He took a step toward the center of the room, and something crunched beneath his boot. He knelt, brushed the dirt aside, and uncovered a small wooden token. Roughly carved, worn smooth at the edges. It bore a mark circular, with slashed lines through the center. Some kind of emblem, branded with care, not art, a claim. Elias held it in his palm, staring. It meant something. It belonged to someone. Above him, on the porch, Santi gasped. Elias climbed up and out of the cellar, rising into the sun with the token still in his hand. Santi hadn't moved from the steps, but now he was pale, trembling. His eyes were fixed not on Elias, but on the token. "You know this?" Elias asked. Santi didn't answer. His breath hitched once, and his lips parted, but no words came. Then, slowly, he nodded. Elias moved to the porch and crouched in front of him, offering the token. Santi stared at it like it was poison. Then, in a voice so quiet Elias had to lean in to hear it, he said, he had them all wear one, so he could remember which ones had already been broken. The wind stirred the dust across the yard. Boone whimpered. Elias looked back toward the open hatch. The ground had given up its secret, but the meaning had only just begun to surface. Elias sat beside the boy on the porch, the wooden token still turning slowly in his fingers. The grooves in the carving caught the sunlight, casting slivered shadows across his palm. It didn't feel like a trinket. It felt like a brand. Something meant to mark, to track, to own. Boone lay curled at their feet, tail still, chest rising slow, as if even he could sense the weight pressing down on the space between man and boy. Santi hadn't looked up since he spoke. His voice had been quiet then, but now it was nothing but silence. Elias didn't press. He just waited, letting the stillness settle, letting the boy speak when he was ready. Finally, Santi whispered, "You thought it was a root cellar." Elias nodded once. "It's not. It's where he kept us." The air didn't move. Elias stopped turning the token. Santi's eyes were distant, unfocused, locked somewhere past the windmill and the ridgeline. There were others, 3 of us at first, me, little Thomas, and Rhea. He said we were lucky. Said he'd taken us from the overflow camps down south, because the ranchers up here needed hands. Strong backs and silent mouths, he called it. Elias stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. He didn't speak, didn't dare interrupt. "He told us we'd be safe," Santi continued. "Said he'd rehome us, give us food, shelter, and if we worked hard and kept quiet, maybe we'd even get a family. That's what he said, a family." He laughed, but it wasn't laughter. It was hollow air through broken teeth. "But we never saw daylight unless it was to scrub troughs or clean his boots. And when one of us got sick, he stopped bringing food. Said it was the Lord's way of thinning the ungrateful." Boone let out a low whimper, as if protesting a sound that hadn't been made. Santi's eyes drifted down to his own wrists. The chains weren't for punishment. They were for routine. We had shifts chained to different corners, so we wouldn't talk, so we'd forget how. Elias finally asked, his voice flat, steady, "Who was he?" The boy blinked slowly. "He wore a badge." "What kind of badge?" Santi looked at him, and in that look was more history than a child should carry. Basin authority. Same as the ones that came last night, only his wasn't pinned straight. He wore it like it was sewn into his skin. Elias breathed in through his nose. The dust tasted bitter. "They all knew," Santi added. "The others. They saw him bring us in, month after month. They said it was off-record placement. Said he was doing the system a favor. Less mouths, more order. And you escaped, Elias said. Not as a question, but as a confirmation of the obvious. Santi nodded. One night, the lock rusted. I broke it with the chain. I didn't stop running until I couldn't remember where the sky ended. Elias stood slowly and looked toward the windmill. The hatch still open, the dark beneath it gaping like a wound. That place had never been a shelter. It was a cage. And someone had built it with purpose. The wind carried heat and silence that afternoon, the kind that made the air itself feel like it was listening. Dust clung to the porch railings, caught in the seams of every board, every hinge, like the land was holding its breath. Elias stood with one hand resting on the doorframe, the other curled loosely around his coffee mug, untouched and cooling by the minute. He hadn't said much since Santi's revelation. What words could outmatch the weight of it? Inside, the boy slept fitfully in the shadowed corner of the parlor, a damp cloth still pressed to his forehead. Boone lay beside him like a sentinel, eyes open, always watching the door. Then came the hooves again. Not distant this time, not masked by dusk or excuse. Just there, approaching at full gallop down the ridge trail. Elias didn't look. He didn't need to. He felt it before he saw it, the second wave of trouble rolling in, same as the first, but harder now, less polite. 4 riders this time. The same leader from before rode up front, but now the smile was gone from his face. His badge gleamed sharp under the noon sunday. The younger deputy followed behind, his shoulders stiff, eyes darting not toward the house but toward the windmill. He remembered the lay of the land. Elias stepped off the porch just as Boone emerged, barking once then again, louder, angrier. The kind of bark that came with teeth. Boone positioned himself between the windmill and the riders, tail low, body taut. The lead man pulled his horse to a stop and called out, "Mr. McCrae, let's skip the formalities this time." Elias didn't respond. Just watched them like a man sizing up a thundercloud, already deciding which tree to stand under when the lightning hits. The lead rider continued, "We've got reason to believe the boy's still here. Might have been confused last night, but now we're sure. He ran straight this way, and we intend to bring him back." Boone barked again, stepping forward. One of the riders reached for his reins nervously. Elias shifted his weight. "That's so. It island." The man's tone was flat, but the confidence in it was razor sharp. "We know he's here." Inside the house, a floorboard creaked. Boone growled, deeper now, his stance rigid. The younger deputy leaned in toward the leader and said something too quiet to catch. The lead man shot him a glare, then looked back at Elias. His hand moved slowly to the rifle slung across his saddle horn. Elias didn't blink. "You gonna tell us the truth now?" the man asked. "Or are we gonna have to look ourselves?" The tension hung in the heat like a taut wire. Boone's growl deepened, vibrating through the dust. Then came the unmistakable sound click, as Elias cocked the rifle he'd hidden behind his leg. Not a threat. A promise. "You so sure about your cause," Elias said, voice like dry timber. "Then you'd best be sure about your next step too." The lead man hesitated. And for the first time, his horse shifted back. The air thickened around them like a rope tightening. Dust swirled lazily between the boots of men who weren't yet enemies but weren't far from it. The sun was high, merciless, burning down on steel buckles and leather holsters, on the glint of the Basin Authority's badges, and on the old scars that crossed Elias McCrae's weathered hands as he held his rifle low but ready. The lead rider dismounted, boots hitting the dirt with a thud that echoed louder than it should have. He pulled off his gloves one finger at a time and tucked them into his belt, all deliberate, all calm. But his eyes never left Elias. "You're standing awful tall for someone harboring a fugitive," he said. Elias didn't flinch. "That boy's not a fugitive, he's a survivor. He ran from custody. He ran from a goddamn hole in the ground. The lead man's jaw ticked. You don't know what you're talking about. I saw the chains, Elias snapped. I saw the token. I heard what he went through under that windmill, my windmill. And I got one question for you, and I suggest you answer it carefully. He took a single step forward, boots grinding the grit beneath him. How many others like him did you were home? A beat of silence. Boone growled behind him, the kind of sound that made bones remember they were mortal. The lead man didn't move. We don't traffic in accusations, McRae. We follow law. You think justice lives in a uniform? Elias spat, voice hard now. You think that badge makes you clean? I've seen the kind of men that wear it. Some of 'em used to wear church collars. Some wore flags. All of 'em hid the same thing behind their eyes. Power, that's all it is to you. You wear it like armor while you bury sins in other folks' soil. A flicker crossed the lead man's face, but he mastered it quick. You've got no proof. I got a chain cellar full of it. Still, the man held his line. If there was anything like that, I'm sure it's the work of one bad apple. The authority doesn't condone. You don't condone it? Elias cut in. Then why's your deputy over there looking at his boots like he knows exactly what I'm talking about? The younger man flinched, slight, barely there. But enough. All eyes shifted to him. He straightened in the saddle, but his hands tightened on the reins. He wouldn't look up, not at Elias, not at the windmill. Elias turned toward him. What's your name, son? The deputy said nothing. You were there, weren't you? Elias pressed. You saw the boy. Maybe you saw others. Maybe you heard the screams and told yourself it wasn't your job. Just follow orders, keep your mouth shut. But tell me, did you sleep after that? Still nothing. But the silence said plenty. The lead man's voice rose, sharp now, defensive. He's got no testimony, no file, no name anyone's gonna recognize in court. He's got scars, Elias said, voice dropping low. And that's more truth than any paper you'd be willing to forge. Another silence fell, longer this time, deeper. The kind that made men wonder what they were standing on solid ground, or a lie too old to carry weight. Boone barked once. The deputy looked up. Just for a second, and his eyes were wet. The porch creaked under Elias's weight as he eased into the old rocking chair, the wood groaning like it remembered pain. The sun had dipped behind the hills, casting the ranch in a long stretch of gold and ash. Inside, Santi lay wrapped in a quilt, eyes closed but restless in sleep, his breath uneven. Boone paced near the windmill now, no longer barking, but unsettled like he, too, could feel ghosts rising with the dust. Elias stared at the horizon, but he wasn't seeing the land. He was somewhere else, someone else. Where the sky bled with smoke and hoofbeats weren't just thunder, they were the sound of people taken. It had been 13 years, maybe 14. The night they came was dry, the wind hot as forge breath. A different kind of authority then, though their badges still shined and their rifles still barked. They called it a relocation. They called it order. They didn't call it theft, though that's what it was. She had been 6. Small hands, bright eyes, and hair wild as the field wheat behind the barn. Her name was Lydia, and Elias still remembered the sound she made when they tore her from Martha's arms. Not a scream, a cry, the kind that split something in your bones and never let it knit back right. He'd fought, God knows he had. Broken one man's jaw and bloodied another's ribs. It took 3 of them to bring him down. He remembered the taste of dirt and iron in his mouth as they dragged Lydia into a wagon with 10 other children. He remembered Martha's sobs, the silence that came after. And then nothing. No word. No record. No body. Just the open wound of not knowing. After the raids, people buried their grief in work and whiskey. Elias buried his in the land. But the soil never forgot. Every fence post he drove, every seed he planted, every hour under that merciless sun, he was still listening for a laugh that never came back. When Santi appeared, broken and bleeding by the arroyo, Elias hadn't thought he'd acted, not because it was noble, not because it was expected, but because something in that boy's eyes struck the same chord that had rung through him for over a decade. The way Santi flinched at footsteps, the way he didn't ask for help, didn't trust kindness. That was Lydia's look, too burned into his memory. The way she'd turned, even at 6, and looked back at him from the wagon, not in panic, but confusion. As if asking why the man she called Papa wasn't able to stop it. "You're not the first to hide a crying child," Elias whispered to the wind. Boone stopped pacing. He sat near the windmill, ears perked, watching the earth. Elias leaned forward, hands clasped. "But by God, you'll be the first I keep." And in that moment, he knew this wasn't about mercy. This was about atonement. About making sure the land that had taken one child didn't swallow another, not while he still breathed. They came at dawn. No thunder of hooves this time. Just the slow, deliberate approach of power that knew it was in control. 6 riders this time, not 4. 2 more on foot. All of them armed, the kind of quiet, practiced readiness that didn't need to announce itself. They moved with the patience of men who'd done this before, encircled a home, cut off escape, waited for fear to do the work bullets didn't have to. The dust hadn't yet lifted from the night. It hung low in the valley, curling around boots and fence posts like smoke from a fire that hadn't finished burning. Elias stood by the windmill, the rifle resting lightly in his hands. Not raised, not lowered, just ready. Boone was by his side, tail stiff, growl low and constant. Behind them, the hatch to the root cellar remained closed now, the metal slightly warped from years of heat and secrecy. The windmill creaked overhead, groaning like it knew its own guilt. Santi stood a few yards back, barefoot in the dirt, eyes darting from rider to rider. His arms were tense, fists clenched like he was holding back the instinct to run. He wasn't just scared. He was resigned. "They're not here to ask again," he said softly. "No," Elias replied. "They're here to erase." The lead rider dismounted slowly, same one as before, jaw tight, badge polished clean. But now there was no pretense, no polite opening. His voice was a command wrapped in diplomacy. "We're giving you one last chance to hand over the boy. If you do, we can keep this from becoming more than it needs to be." Elias didn't move. "Funny how your kind always shows up just before the truth gets out. This isn't about truth, it's about the law. You don't mean law, you mean control, you mean quiet." Santi took a step forward, placing himself between Elias and the riders. His voice cracked, but it was clear. "I'll go." Elias turned his head, not all the way, just enough to see the boy's face. "No. If I go, they'll leave you alone," Santi insisted. "They'll stop pushing. You said yourself land's worth more than blood." "I lied." The boy blinked. Elias raised his voice, eyes never leaving the circle tightening around them. "You don't get to name what justice is just because you've got a badge and a horse. Justice don't chain children to walls and feed 'em lies. Justice don't mark kids with wood like they're cattle. What you want, what you always wanted, ain't justice." The lead man stepped forward, resting a hand on his pistol grip. "We'll take him, one way or another." Elias lifted the rifle now, deliberate, calm. "You take one more step, and you'll find out that some of us remember how to stand." A breeze moved through then, cool and sudden, snapping the old prayer flags tied to the windmill's base. For a moment, everything stilled. Even the horses quieted. Boone growled louder, then barked once sharp and final. "They don't want justice," Elias said, staring straight at Santi. "They want silence." And this ranch had been quiet long enough. The barn was a cathedral of dust and memory. Tall, timber-framed and weathered by decades of sun and storm. It stood like a sentinel on the edge of Elias's land, quietly keeping its secrets. Most days, he barely entered it, just enough to feed Boone or fetch old tools from the wall hooks. But now, lantern in hand, rifle slung behind him, and the carved token clutched tight in his fist, Elias stepped inside with purpose. The standoff had broken at sunset, the Basin men retreating but not retreating far. Their silhouettes still lingered just beyond the tree line, watching, waiting, hoping pressure and time would force a crack. But it wasn't fear that drove Elias into the barn. It was confirmation. He moved past the hay racks and broken tack, through a thin shaft of evening light breaking between warped boards, toward the back corner where a rusted footlocker sat beneath a tarp. He hadn't opened it in years, not since Martha passed, not since grief had turned into something quieter but no less sharp. The lock still worked, though the key stuck. He jimmied it loose with a grunt and lifted the lid. Inside lay the ledger. Hard leather cover, corners curled, edges gnawed by mice long gone. He pulled it out and carried it to the workbench, lighting the second lantern above. Boone sat nearby, ears alert but calm. The silence inside the barn felt reverent now, a hush meant for revelation. Elias opened the book. The names were handwritten, tight and uniform. Dates, locations, initials in columns. Not official government print, but that was the point. This wasn't policy. This was procedure, hidden beneath euphemisms like placement and shelter routing. Elias turned page after page, watching the list of children grow. Ages as young as 5, some marked R, returnable. Others marked H, held. A few had a tiny circle drawn beside their name, with a slash through the center. He stopped cold. The symbol from the token. He looked down at the piece of carved wood still in his palm. The mark wasn't just a brand, it was an index, a code. He flipped back a page. There it was again, beside another name, and another, dozens of them. Some lines struck through, others untouched. The pattern was deliberate. He turned to the next page and froze. Lydia McCrae. Age 6. Intake date, March 3rd. His hand trembled, his breath caught. He read it again, as if the page might suddenly say something else. Placement code, H. Marked with the same circle and slash. A name. After all these years, a name in ink where before there had only been silence. He closed his eyes, clenched his jaw. She had been processed. Not lost. Not stolen by accident. Filed. Filed and hidden. Like all the others. Elias opened the footlocker further, digging beneath the blanket. There were more ledgers, more records. A network built on paperwork and vanished children. All of it buried in his barn while he'd mourned in ignorance. He turned toward Boone. This ain't just about the boy anymore. Boone tilted his head. They rode her down like cattle, Elias muttered, voice like stone. And I'm gonna make damn sure the world reads it back. The morning came cloaked in a strange hush, not the quiet of peace, but the kind that settles before a verdict. The Basin men had returned in full force, 6 riders mounted, 2 more on foot near the fence line, and now a gathering crowd of ranchers and locals had begun to drift in behind them. Word had traveled fast. It always did when justice and defiance stood on the same patch of dirt. Elias stood at the center, boots planted in the churned soil near the windmill, the old ledger held tight in his hands. Dust circled around him in small, anxious spirals. Santi stood just behind, half shielded by Boone's constant presence. The dog didn't bark. He didn't growl. He just watched, waiting for the signal that something was about to break. The lead authority officer dismounted once again, every movement practiced and meant to dominate. "We warned you, McCrae," he said, voice sharp as gravel. "You're obstructing a state-sanctioned retrieval." "This ain't retrieval," Elias replied. "This is cleanup. You're here to silence, not solve." The man sneered. You think waving old notebooks changes the law? Elias didn't answer him. Instead, he turned and looked directly at the younger deputy, the one who'd flinched before, who hadn't spoken much since his first ride onto the property. The kid stood rigid, eyes fixed on the horizon, jaw locked tight. You, Elias called out, loud enough for the whole group to hear. Name's Jensen, right? The deputy blinked, hesitated. Elias held up the ledger and began flipping through pages. You recognize this, don't you? Maybe you saw the older ones in a station filing drawer. Maybe you weren't supposed to. Don't speak to my men, the lead officer barked, but Elias ignored him. Jensen, Elias said again, slower now. I need you to read something for me. The boy didn't move. I need you to say it out loud. He held up the ledger, open to a page he'd marked with a torn scrap of cloth. Right here, name, age, placement code. Jensen's lips parted, but no sound came. He looked to his superior, then to the crowd, then finally to Elias. And in that moment, something cracked, just a hairline fracture, but enough. He walked forward slowly, boots crunching over dry ground. Elias handed him the book. Jensen looked down. His mouth moved as he read, barely audible at first. Rachel Jensen, age 7, placement code H. He froze. Elias nodded once. You had a sister, didn't you? Disappeared in 06? Jensen's hands began to tremble. They said she died, fever. Funny how they told a lot of us the same story. Elias said, stepping back now so the crowd could see the boy's face, see the truth as it landed. Murmurs began to ripple. A rancher in the back crossed his arms. Another leaned in, whispering to his wife. Doubt moved through the group like lightning, looking for a tree. You read her name, Elias said softly. Now ask yourself what else they buried. The lead officer growled. You don't know what you're, I know exactly what I'm doing. Elias cut in, voice cold steel. And now, so does he. And with that, silence broke. The kind that didn't hush, the kind that spread. The sun dipped low, staining the sky with bruised purples and burnt gold, casting long shadows that reached like fingers across the ranch. Dust hung in the air, unmoving. Even the wind seemed reluctant to speak. It was the hour when work usually paused and men sat with a bottle or a prayer. But today, there was no rest, only reckoning. They came on foot and horseback, in wagons and beat-up trucks. Ranchers from all sides of the basin, men and women whose names Elias had known for decades and others he only recognized by face. Some had sons in the authority. Others had lost daughters to the quiet machinery of state protection. None of them spoke as they gathered, at least not loudly. The silence between them was heavy, weighted with unasked questions and truths too long buried. They stood in a rough circle between the porch and the windmill, boots stamping dry ground. Hats pulled low to shield eyes from more than just Sunday. The basin men kept to the outer edge, still armed, still wearing the badge, but now, they were surrounded by more than just a house. They were surrounded by witnesses. Elias stood near the hatch to the old cellar, the ledger in one hand, the carved token in the other. Santi remained close behind him, wrapped in a wool blanket, face half hidden but gaze sharp. Boone sat at the boy's side, unmoving. It was an old man who finally spoke, voice rough from dust and age. You sure that book's real, Elias? Elias opened it slowly, showing pages of names, placements, marks. Names don't lie. Not when they're written down to hide shame. Another voice, from a woman in a long denim duster. That token. My niece had one just like it. I thought it was from a church camp. Never saw her again after she was taken from the town lot. They said she got sent east. Never heard from her again. Jensen, the young deputy, stepped forward then, still holding the page with his sister's name. His voice cracked. They told us to stop asking after the files, said they were sealed, said they were lost in a fire. But I saw the names. I didn't know what I was looking at. The authority officer tried to cut in. You're being manipulated. This is a distraction, an emotional ambush. We came for one boy. That ledger's unverified. It's not evidence, it's a narrative. Elias turned to face the crowd. So what do? Hand him over? Pretend none of this happened? Pretend the bones under this land ain't stacked like cordwood as long as the dirt stays quiet? He looked around. One by one, faces met his. No longer passive, no longer undecided. A woman near the front nodded. If we give him up now, we give up every child they took. Another stepped forward. Then we're not just witnesses, we're accomplices. A murmur spread. It wasn't a vote, it wasn't formal. It was a turning. And in that dusk-light silence, the authority felt something it hadn't felt in years. Outnumbered. The last of the sun dipped behind the ridge as Elias stepped toward the windmill, lantern in one hand, crowbar in the other. The circle of ranchers parted for him, no one speaking now. There were no speeches left to give. Just proof. Boone followed silently at his side, his paws barely disturbing the dust. Santee stood with the crowd, wrapped in his blanket, eyes locked on the old windmill like it might bite if stared at too long. The boy's shoulders were square now. Not unafraid, but no longer running. Elias reached the rusted trapdoor embedded in the dry earth, the one he'd once mistaken for a broken piece of irrigation equipment or a long-forgotten tool hatch. Now it looked like what it had always been, a wound in the land. He wedged the crowbar into the edge and leaned his weight into it. The metal groaned, resisting, and then gave with a sudden wrenching crack. A gust of stale air rose from the gap, heavy with the scent of rot, rust, and something worse, remembrance. He looked back once at the people gathered. Then he lifted the lantern and descended. The cellar was as it had been. Damp stone walls, uneven earth floor. The faint impression of bodies long gone left in the dust. The light caught the chains first, still bolted to the stone, still looped with rusted cuffs that clinked faintly in the air movement. They hadn't been disturbed, they hadn't needed to be. Their silence said enough. Elias bent down and picked up the wooden token, left in the center of the room like a breadcrumb for conscience. He climbed back into the open air, holding it in his calloused hand as he turned to face the crowd. No one moved. He tossed the token onto the ground near the trapdoor, where it landed with a soft, final thud. Then, slowly, he lifted the chain. It clinked dully, not with drama, but with weight. He held it up like a question that didn't need an answer. No one spoke, not the authority men, not the ranchers, not even Boone, who now sat with ears flat, watching the circle of faces. Elias's voice broke the silence, not loud, just steady, clear as cut stone. You don't cover a wound, you clean it. The words hung there. He dropped the chain to the ground. They built this place to vanish people, he continued, and they counted on the rest of us being too busy, too scared, or too obedient to ask why. He turned to the lead authority man, who stood pale, fists clenched at his sides, lips pressed tight. For once, he had no script to fall back on, no citation, no bluff. Elias pointed to the open trapdoor. That ain't a shelter, that's a confession. A rancher near the back stepped forward and spit in the dirt. Another crossed their arms and nodded. The tide had shifted. The ground hadn't opened with thunder. No scream had erupted from the cellar. But the truth had arrived just the same. And now, everyone had seen it. The sun rose slow the next morning, not in triumph, but in quiet revelation. The land looked the same. Dust still clung to the fence posts. The windmill still leaned against the sky like an old sentinel, but something beneath it all had shifted, not cracked, settled. The basin men were gone. 2 of them had ridden out during the night without a word, disappearing down the ridgeline like they'd never come at all. 2 more were placed under restraint by the very people they'd once claimed to protect, badges stripped from their coats, weapons surrendered, wrists bound with the same kind of cord once used to lead livestock. One of them, the young deputy, hadn't fought it, hadn't spoken a word since reading his sister's name aloud. The others stood in silence, not yet arrested but no longer in command. Their power had leaked from them like water from a cracked pail, slow at first, then all at once. The ledger lay open on the porch table now, names exposed to the wind. The townsfolk had taken it into their own hands, copying names, whispering memories, piecing together stories long thought lost. One woman sobbed as she found her brother's initials. A man with a cane clutched the token Elias had uncovered and said nothing for a long time. No one asked Elias what came next. They already knew. He stood by the windmill, watching the horizon. Santi was at his side, face turned toward the rising light, one hand resting on Boone's back. The boy didn't flinch anymore. He didn't hunch his shoulders or scan the tree line for threats. He stood still. Boone sat quietly beside them. No bark, no growl, just presence. The way a dog rests when the storm has passed and the home is still standing. The windmill groaned once, an old creaking sigh, as a gust of wind caught the rusted blades and nudged them into a slow, reluctant spin. It was the first time they'd moved in years. Elias didn't speak, he just watched. The boy finally said, "It's still there, isn't it? The place underground." Elias nodded. "It island. Are you gonna tear it out?" Elias looked down at the boy, then back toward the trapdoor, now sealed again with bolts and boards. "No," he said, "not yet." "Why not?" "Because people need to see it. Not just hear about it. See it. Until then, they'll forget. Like they always do." Santi didn't answer. But he stayed beside him, eyes steady. From across the field came the slow sound of voices rising, not angry, not panicked, just ordinary talk. Plans, questions, a man asking where they could store the documents, a woman wondering if someone should ride into town and speak to the magistrate. The rhythm of rebuilding. Peace doesn't roar. It doesn't announce itself with banners or grand declarations. It breathes, quietly. In the absence of chains, in the steadiness of a boy no longer running, in the stillness of a dog that has nothing left to warn about. The windmill creaked again, and this time, Elias didn't wince at the sound. He just let it turn. The days that followed were slow and full of dust, but the kind of dust that settles rather than stings. The land exhaled, finally, after years of holding its breath. No more riders circled the property. No more questions came from behind mirrored badges. What remained now was the work, real work, the kind you could see in the curve of a shovel's back or the callus on a palm. Elias welcomed it. Santi stayed. He didn't ask to. He didn't need to. He simply stopped glancing toward the road and started waking up earlier. He fed the chickens without being told, learned how to mend fence wire, how to saddle a horse. He spoke more, bit by bit, still quiet, still watchful, but the silence no longer held fear. It held choice. That mattered. Boone took to trailing him, not guarding him. That too was a change. One morning, Elias started building something behind the barn. No blueprints, just instinct and sweat. Not a barn, not another trapdoor in the ground, a shelter above the earth. Stone and timber, thick-walled and facing the east so the light would find it first. It had windows that opened, a stove that didn't smoke, and space enough for more than one bed. Santi helped. He didn't ask what it was for. They both knew. It was for the next one. For the child who would arrive in the middle of the night, barefoot and starved, running from men who called themselves order. It was for the ones who didn't have ledgers with their names in them, for the ones who never made it far enough to be counted. The cellar beneath the windmill remained locked, but not buried. Sometimes Elias took visitors down there, slowly, letting the silence speak louder than any lecture. Other times, he let the hatch sit untouched, knowing the weight of that quiet was its own kind of justice. The ledger made it to the capital. A writer from the neighboring township volunteered to take it, tucked in a satchel lined with cloth, as if protecting scripture. It was signed for, filed, and at least for now, not ignored. Investigations began. Not all would lead to truth, but enough might. On a cool afternoon, Elias and Santi sat on the porch, watching Boone chase shadows across the yard. The windmill creaked softly in the distance. Elias held a letter in his hands, confirmation that a commission had been formed. There were words like inquiry and accountability and independent review. Bureaucracy trying to clothe its guilt in process. But still, it was something. Santi looked up. "You think it'll change anything?" Elias didn't answer right away. He leaned back, eyes on the sky. "Depends," he said. "On what?" Elias turned to him. "On what people choose to hear." Santi nodded, like he understood more than he wanted to admit. Boone barked once from the yard. Not out of alarm, just a sound, casual and alive. And the wind carried it farther than it had any right to. As the frame stilled, fading into dusk, a single line appeared against the final image. "Would you have listened to the dog?"